Hey, welcome. It's good to see everybody again as we're continuing on during this time that we're basically having church over the internet. But I started a series last week, which was a couple weeks away from Easter, that just stories Jesus told, and I thought until we can get back together, that I can just kind of go down through some of the stories that Jesus told, because Jesus made a statement. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he'd tell a story. So he told us the reasons that he used parables was so that people could remember them, because remember, most of the people at the time could not read or write. But he also did it to hide it from those who didn't really want to know anyway. So therefore, the seeking you'll find, because within these stories, Christ has so many things that show us not only how to live, but basically this whole thought of secrets of the kingdom, of what Jesus would call secrets of the kingdom. And so soil and soils we talked about last week, and then this week today's title is just forgiveness. And one of the most powerful stories that Jesus told is referred to as the parable of the unforgiving servant, and it's powerful in its presentation, but underneath the surface is this perspective, if you will, God's perspective. And it really is. It's powerful when you can see it. So that's what I want to do today. So we're gonna go through the parable itself and have some notes for you on different things, and then at the very end we'll pull all of it together and just kind of share with you some what I like to call things to learn. So anyway, take a look, if you will, in Matthew chapter 18 and in verse 21. It says, "Then Peter came up and said to him," that is to Jesus, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me that I forgive him? As many as 7 times." And so Peter came up and asked Jesus a question. And he asked about this whole idea of having to forgive others who've sinned against you. And basically that the thought was, and Peter said up to 7 times. And then Peter thought he was actually going the extra mile there, because the standard for the time was you have to forgive them 3 times. But then Peter kind of more than doubled it, went to 7. And so the thought here is, you shouldn't expect me to keep forgiving people, right? There has to be a time where I stop forgiving them. There has to be a ceiling. There has to be a limit, right? And so that really is the heart of the question. And so Peter was wanting a rule he could follow, as opposed to a principle that guided him. And so how many times do I have to count before I can look at someone and say, I don't forgive you, is basically the thought. So then Jesus, in order to share this, Jesus tells a parable to explain it. And it's a powerful parable. But let's take a look. And Jesus said, in verse 22, Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Some of your translations might say 70 times 7. Well, if it's 77 or if it's 70 times 7, it doesn't really matter. Jesus is saying here basically is that there is no limit, which really cuts against the human grain, right? It really does, because if there's anything, is that payback and all of the different things, restitution and vengeance and all the rest that goes with it, then it's a different kind of a thought. This is why, if you're his, right? This is why, if you're truly a believer, you're going to live differently than the world around you. It's not going to make sense how the world around you lives. So when you begin to look at this, it's an incredible parable that has a lot to it. So let's take a look. So if you want to follow along with us, there are basically three people in this story that Jesus told. Usually when Jesus told a story is that people within the story have different representations. Okay, I'll go ahead and tell them, all right, to you. All right, the first one is the king in this one. That's God the Father, right, in this particular parable. And the first servant, and let's just say that that's you or that's me. Either way you want to look at it. Okay, and then the second servant is the one who owes you, or the one who has sinned against you. So really, that's all you really need to know and follow it. All right. So if you want, here's some notes just to kind of hang everything on. All right. Number one is the day of reckoning. All right. The day of reckoning. All right. Take a look, if you will, in verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king. Notice here it says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like, or may be compared to. So there's something in this parable that teaches us about the kingdom, is what he's saying, right? May be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. So you have this picture then. A king wants to bring in and say, okay, the debts are due, right? And verse 24 then, all right? So number one is a day of reckoning. Therefore, there's always a day of an accountability where you bring in and say, okay, the debts that you owe have come due, you need to pay them. And so you have then this day of reckoning that is a day where we will all give an account. Number two is an unpayable debt. All right, let's take a look at it now, if you will. In verse 24. It says this, when he began to settle, one of his servants was brought to him, who owed him 10,000 talents, right? And it goes on to say, and since he was not able to pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children, all that he has, so that the payment may be made. Now, so this first servant, that represents you and I, this what I call unpayable debt. Jesus is the master storyteller here. He is setting a situation to where somebody owes someone 10,000 talents. Now, that may not seem like a huge deal to you, but this was just a huge sum. In fact, 10,000 talents, you have to remember that they found an old they dug something up in the whole Palestine area. And the taxes for 1 year from the entire region were like 400 talents. So 10,000 talents, people have estimated how much that could be. Depending, current day, somewhere between 50, 70, perhaps even closer to $100 million in our currency. So you're talking about a debt that could not be paid. So the king, who represents who God is, and then this debt represents you and I's sin, right? And therefore, we can't pay ourselves, which is the reason Christ had to come anyway. Then you see an incredible story that Jesus is telling to help us understand. So then, therefore, Jesus picked this huge figure. It represents an unpayable debt, right? Now, number three, right? There's a cancellation, right? A total canceling of this debt. Look at verse 26. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I'll pay you everything. Right? And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him of the debt. So the guy humbled himself, and he asked for more time, but let's be honest, more time doesn't help. I mean, how is he ever going to repay a debt like this? He's not ever going to be. So the guy doesn't need more time. The guy needs a miracle, right? The guy needs forgiveness of this debt is what he needs. And that's what is offered to him, all right? Let's just call it $100 million. And this king forgives that entire debt, and it says here, frees him and lets him go, looses him from the debt, basically looks at him and says, you don't owe me anymore. So this guy, this guy represents you and I, who are his, who are believers. We've come to a time in our lives where we put our faith and trust in him. And when we understand what the scriptures teach, they teach us that we are free from that. We have been forgiven, cut loose. It can never be held, it can never be held against us again because it's been paid for on our behalf. So it is an amazing thing. I could almost call this parable, this story, the parable of perspective. Because when you and I keep the proper perspective, this forgiveness thing stays on solid footing. But whenever we lose perspective, it's an amazing thing how these things will get the best of us. Anyway, but guys, out of all of the things I've done through the years and met with so many people, this is one issue that I think has caused more destruction than any other single issue. Whenever we have a lack of forgiveness, it's like sand in an engine block. It destroys people. And in reality, it destroys the person who has been sinned against. And because they carry a grudge, and it just eats away at them. There's different there's different types of forgiveness. There's God's forgiveness for us. There's our accepting God's forgiveness and living in the freedom of it. Then there's our forgiving others, which is what this parable is about. But perspective keeps it help and keeps it understand. All right, keeps it understood. So the big thought here to remember is that forgiveness is never free. Never. It may be free to you. It's like this guy who owed $100 million. All right, he was forgiven of that debt. That means he doesn't have to pay it. But that doesn't mean that somebody didn't pay. Somebody did pay. The king paid for it, right? So you have this picture is that forgiveness is what makes it hard, is that the wronged party has to pay. That's what makes forgiveness tough. And that's why people have a hard time with it, because it's not fair, right? Well, it's not fair. Forgiveness, if you're looking for fair, forgiveness won't ever be in your life, right? Because justice is fair. But what's being asked for here is not justice, but mercy and forgiveness and grace, right? So again, as you see down through this, you're going, wow, that is what that says, right? All right. So basically a total cancellation of debt. Number four is a debt now that's owed you. Verse 28 says this. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay me what you owe me." 100 denarii is basically 100 days' wages for a common laborer. It's not a huge amount, but it's not a small amount either. So it's enough to hurt, right? And so when you take a look at it, he immediately goes out and finds somebody else who owes him a debt. And he begins to choke him, it says, right? Pay me what you owe me. And basically, this second servant, that is someone who sinned against you. The second servant is, he represents somebody who sinned against you. But I want you to hear what it says here about him. Take a look now, if you will, in verse 29. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I'll pay you." And he refused, and he went and he put him in prison until he could pay the debt. So basically, this other servant looked for forgiveness, and basically this one said no, whatever, choking him, whatever, and having him thrown into prison. Now, remember, this was customary at the time. It was called debtor's prison. Is if you didn't pay your debts, You could go to prison until they were paid. And so at the time, then you're looking at this picture. So he doesn't forgive him. He throws him into a prison until he can pay him back. And this is the crux of it, you know. It can be painful when people, sin against us. But in comparison, it's not even worth talking about. 100 denarii, Jesus does this on purpose. 100 denarii versus 10,000 talents is like not even worth talking about. So it comes down to perspective. That's why it's so important that you and I live in the forgiveness God has for us, because it gives us the power, perspective, and strength to forgive others when they've wronged us. It is a powerful thing when you begin to take a look at it. This powerful parable teaches a powerful lesson on this thing called forgiveness. So basically, it's a comparison thought here. Number 5, all right? A stern rebuke. Take a look at verse 31. And when his fellow servants saw that what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and they reported to their master all that had taken place. Right? Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you of all that debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" Right? In his anger, he delivered him to the jailers until he should pay his debt. So also, the Heavenly Father do to every one of you, does not forgive your brother from your heart. So it basically puts this guy into prison, right? And again, it becomes those of us that are truly his. We have experienced such tremendous forgiveness. Just such tremendous forgiveness. And so then you and I then should have this ability and drive and something deep down inside of us that says, because I have been forgiven so much, there's no way I can't forgive others. So then it becomes a perspective, right? Now, basically, if you truly are his today, I can promise you this, God's not going to let you live like this. This is not something that he's going to allow you to live like. You're not going to be able to live. If you're truly his, if truly you have been forgiven, if heaven is your home, right, you went from death to life and all these different things, new creation have happened to you, then he's not going to let you live in unforgiveness, right? And that's something he's going to teach you. In fact, it's one of the foundational things I think that God teaches us as believers, is because forgiveness, we are never more like Christ than when forgiveness is part of us. All right, so as we come to the end here, I have some things to learn, and there's just walking down kind of a summary of these things. I like these things to learn, especially with parables, because it helps us to tell the story and then to come back and then make sure we hit everything, right? First thing to learn, right, is remember this, is that grace is always found in forgiveness, right? Grace is always found in forgiveness. Grace is a gift you don't deserve. Well, then by its nature, what is forgiveness? Well, in this particular instance, it was a huge debt that this guy was responsible for that debt. If you have a debt, you're responsible for it. Therefore, the king forgave him, so it was an act of grace. Therefore, a gift that you don't deserve. And when you see and understand grace, when you understand the song "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Therefore, when you get a good picture of who Christ is, what he came to do, grace is foundational. Therefore, grace and forgiveness are interlocked. I don't know that you can have one without the other, but definitely with forgiveness, grace is always going to be there, because I heard somebody say that well, you should forgive them because they deserve to be forgiven. No, if it truly is forgiven, they don't deserve it. Forgiveness is not deserved, right? Forgiveness is something that is given really out of goodness of heart, or out of a desire to let somebody go free, right? And so it is not natural. In fact, through the years, it has been one of the hardest things to talk to people about, because they look at me, they almost get mad at me, and when they say, Pastor, I can't believe you would expect me to forgive something. Haven't you heard what they've done to me? Well, I get it. I do get it. It's a tough concept. And the more they owe you, right, in that mentality, the bigger the debt, the more painful the forgiveness, right? But that's what grace is. And if God has truly dumped all this grace and forgiveness on you, then it is something that he expects, all right? Number 2, always remember that these two debts are not even comparable. Therefore, what somebody may owe you is not compared to the debt that God forgave you of. So it's one of those things that it's a perspective thing. It's perspective. Number 3, and this can be a tough one, but forgiveness is not an option for a believer, right? Therefore, it's something that God has an expectation. Because if you truly live in and understand the difference that he's made in your life, then how can we withhold that from someone else on such a minor scale in comparison? I have found that those who are truly a new creation, unless you're still real young in your faith and you're still learning, this becomes a thing that you and I get better at, because the more we become like Christ, the more that forgiveness will be part of our lives, right? Because it's in essence who Christ is. It's why he came, and so that's if we're going to be like him, made into the likeness of Christ, as the Scripture says, then this is going to be a part of our lives, and it's a tough part. A lot of times, if you find it easy, then you're probably not doing it right? Because forgiveness is a painful thing, always has been. Obviously, death on the cross, right, is the picture of that, ultimately. So good. Forgiveness is an option. And 4, and then finally, a lack of forgiveness, if you're a believer, a lack of forgiveness will make you a miserable person. And there's something about this, as I've learned through the years. There's something about when we fail to forgive, we put ourselves in our own prison cell and lock it up and make ourselves miserable. And in reality, I think that's the picture here, is that God's not going to let you live that way. And I think a lot of the struggles that believers may have in their lives is just simple lack of forgiveness of people in their lives, holding grudges and anger and everything that goes with it. The anger that turns into bitterness, that turns into affecting how you think, how you sleep, right? All kinds of things when we hold these things close. So there's great freedom, right? There's great freedom in forgiveness, but that does not mean it's easy. It's one of those things that doesn't feel right. Because there's this sense of fairness that says, if I forgive them, then I'm letting them get away with it. And in reality, that's what you're doing. But that was what was done for you. It is an interesting thing, right? Forgiveness in our culture is almost turned into weakness. That is, you allow somebody to get away with it, right? But as a believer, that's why you and I are going to live so different. Because what our world may look at in one way, the Scriptures, this is what it's taught us how to live. And we're going to be different. Why? Because this new creation that's in us is growing us to be different from this world. So anyway, it's just one of those great things. If there's never been any time, in fact, one of the great ways you might be able to realize that you're not a believer is that this inability to forgive or even want to. Because I do feel this, if you've ever experienced his forgiveness for you, then this will be something that will be a conviction in here. But if there's never been a time in your life, that's the first step. You have to experience God's forgiveness for you. And then, after you become his, then you begin to grow in the other. But if you are a believer today, then the one thing to think on, what is it, are those things in your life that really keep you back, that weight you down, that cause so much struggle in you? I can guarantee a good bit of them have to do with this area. So anyway, but as we close today, I'm gonna have a word of prayer with us. But this is one of those great stories to remember that Jesus told, that says that, if you will, it's secrets of the kingdom of living the way God's called you to live. All right, God bless you. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be done. Lord, thank you for this service, Lord, on this Sunday, and God, we thank you for your incredible love for us. That God, that you loved us so much that you paid our debt, an incredible debt, and that God, you've called us to forgive those around us. So Lord, this time is yours. If we've learned anything today, God, we know it's because of you and because it's your word, and God, we'll give you the glory for it. And Lord, pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, God bless. Y'all have a great day.